The Monteiro residence, once a symbol of prosperity in the neighborhood, now emanated a sinister aura that made neighbors cross the street to avoid it. The curtains remained closed, and the gardens, once meticulously cared for, withered under the weight of an evil presence. It all began when Lucia Monteiro, a 16-year-old teenager, brought home an old Ouija board bought at a thrift store. Fascinated by the occult, she convinced two friends to participate in a session on a new moon night. What they didn't know was that this simple act would open a door to something far beyond their understanding. In the following weeks, unexplainable events began to plague the house. Objects moved on their own, shadows slid across walls, and an unnatural cold permeated the rooms, even on the hottest days. Lucia, initially skeptical, began to change. Her once vivacious personality became dark and volatile. Carolina and Roberto, Lucia's parents, first attributed the changes to adolescence. But when they found their daughter talking to herself in unknown languages, they realized something was terribly wrong. The last straw came on a stormy night when Lucia attacked her younger brother with superhuman strength, her eyes completely black and her voice distorted into an inhuman growl. Desperate, the Monteiros turned to the local church. Father Antonio, a middle-aged man with experience in unusual cases, visited the house. Upon crossing the threshold, he immediately felt the evil that permeated the place. Climbing the stairs towards Lucia's room, each step seemed heavier than the last. The scene that awaited him was pure horror. Lucia, or what was left of her, was contorted in impossible positions, levitating half a meter above the bed. The walls were covered in writings in ancient languages, made with what appeared to be blood. The smell of decay and sulfur was overwhelming. In the name of God, identify yourself. Father Antonio shouted, raising his crucifix. The answer came in a cacophony of voices. We are Legion. This child belongs to us now. Thus began a spiritual battle that would last for days. Father Antonio, aided by two other priests, faced terrifying manifestations. Furniture flew across the room, temperatures oscillated between scorching heat and glacial cold, and the entity demonstrated knowledge of dark secrets from each of their pasts. The Monteiro family, exhausted and terrified, alternated between periods of hope and despair. Carolina spent hours on her knees, praying incessantly, while Roberto struggled to maintain sanity and protect their younger son from the horrors unfolding. On the third day of the exorcism, when everyone's strength seemed to be at its limit, something changed. Lucia's voice, her true voice, briefly emerged, begging for help. It was the moment Father Antonio had been waiting for. Gathering his last reserves of strength and faith, he intensified his prayers, feeling divine energy flow through him. The room was engulfed in a blinding light, and a deafening scream echoed through the house, shattering the windows. When the light dissipated, Lucia lay unconscious on the bed, her body finally at peace. In the days that followed, the Monteiro family began the long process of recovery and healing. The house was blessed and purified, and slowly life began to return to normal. Lucia, though traumatized, was back, free from the evil presence. Father Antonio, deeply marked by the experience, knew that this battle was won, but the war against darkness was eternal. As he watched the Monteiro family recover, he couldn't help but wonder when and where evil would manifest again, and if he would be prepared to face it once more. The months following the exorcism were a period of slow and painful recovery for the Monteiro family. The house, once a refuge, now seemed to carry the invisible scars of the terror that had unfolded there. Lucia, although free from possession, struggled against vivid nightmares and disturbing memory lapses. Carolina and Roberto decided to seek professional help, not just for Lucia, but for the entire family. Therapy sessions revealed how deeply the event had affected each of them. Lucia's younger brother, Pedro, only 10 years old, began to exhibit obsessive-compulsive behaviors, repeatedly checking if doors and windows were locked. Meanwhile, Father Antonio faced his own internal battles. The church temporarily relieved him of his duties, citing the need for rest and reflection. In truth, the Monteiro case had drawn unwanted attention from the media and skeptic groups, who questioned the veracity of the exorcism. Antonio spent sleepless nights, reviewing every detail of the ritual, tormented by doubt about whether he had truly expelled all the evil or if something still remained dormant. In the town, the story of the Monteiro house became an urban legend. Teenagers made dares to ring the doorbell and run away, while more superstitious neighbors began to make the sign of the cross when passing in front of the residence. The family found themselves isolated, torn between the desire to forget and the need to understand what had happened. 6 months after the exorcism, strange events began to occur again, albeit more subtly. Objects moved during the night, and sometimes whispers were heard coming from empty rooms. Lucia, although reluctant, admitted that she sometimes felt a presence watching her. Roberto, determined to protect his family, began obsessively researching occultism and spiritual protection. His office transformed into a repository of esoteric books, amulets, and symbols from various religions. Carolina, on the other hand, delved deeper into her Catholic faith, turning one of the rooms into an improvised chapel. Tension in the house grew day by day. The disagreements between Roberto and Carolina about how to handle the situation began to affect their marriage. Lucia, feeling guilty for having brought that darkness into her family, began to isolate herself more and more. It was at this critical moment that an unexpected figure entered the scene. Maria, an old friend of Carolina who had moved to India years before, returned to town. A practitioner of meditation and student of Eastern philosophies, Maria offered a different perspective on the events. She suggested that, instead of trying to fight or ignore what had happened, the family should seek understanding and balance. Maria introduced meditation and mindfulness techniques, teaching them to recognize and process their fears without being consumed by them. Gradually, a change began to occur in the Monteiro house. The heavy atmosphere began to dissipate. Lucia, finding strength in meditation, started to recall fragments of her experience during the possession, no longer with terror, but with a sense of detachment and understanding. Father Antonio, inspired by Maria's approach, began to re-examine his own faith and practices. He realized that the battle against evil was not just an external conflict, but also an internal journey of self-knowledge and spiritual growth. As the Monteiro family learned to integrate their traumatic experience, rather than deny it, a profound transformation occurred. The house, once an epicenter of terror, became a place of healing and reflection. Neighbors, drawn to the new energy of the place, began to approach again. A year after the exorcism, the family held a renewal ceremony, blending elements from various spiritual traditions. The event, attended by Father Antonio and Maria, symbolized not only the closing of a dark chapter, but the beginning of a new journey of growth and understanding. The Monteiro story, although still whispered with a mix of fear and fascination throughout the town, became a testimony to the power of human resilience in the face of the inexplicable. And as life went on, the family carried with them the awareness that the boundaries between light and darkness, good and evil, were more tenuous and complex than they had ever imagined. 5 years had passed since the fateful exorcism. The Monteiro family, although transformed by the experience, had found a new balance. Lucia, now 21, was beginning her journey in college studying psychology, determined to use her experience to help others deal with deep traumas. The house, once a symbol of terror, had become a place of discreet pilgrimage for people seeking spiritual healing. Carolina and Roberto, with Maria's guidance, had transformed the basement, formerly the epicenter of the most intense manifestations, into a center for meditation and alternative therapy. However, the newly found peace was about to be shaken. On an autumn night, Pedro, now a 15-year-old teenager, woke up screaming, his body covered in scratch marks that seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The nightmares that had not tormented him for so long returned with full force. The family, fearing a recurrence of past events, gathered in council. Lucia, applying her knowledge of psychology, suggested it could be a delayed manifestation of Pedro's trauma. Roberto, still cautious, proposed a deeper investigation into the supernatural aspects. Carolina, for her part, hesitated between calling Father Antonio or consulting Maria. As they debated, inexplicable events began to occur again in the house. However, unlike the first time, the manifestation seemed focused exclusively on Pedro. Objects in his room moved, voices whispered his name in the shadows, and an oppressive presence followed him through the house. Lucia, determined to protect her brother, dove into research, combining her psychology studies with the esoteric knowledge accumulated by the family. She theorized that the original entity, although exorcised, might have left a psychic echoes that now resonated with Pedro, who was the same age Lucia had been during the initial possession. Father Antonio, when consulted, was hesitant to perform another exorcism. His years of reflection had led him to a more holistic approach to spirituality. He suggested a collaboration between the Church, Maria's Eastern practices, and Lucia's psychological perspective. Thus, an unusual team formed to help Pedro, Lucia with her psychological perspective, Father Antonio representing the Catholic tradition, Maria with her Eastern practices, and Roberto and Carolina, united in their determination to protect their son. For weeks, they worked tirelessly. Lucia conducted therapy sessions with Pedro, helping him process not only recent events, but also the repressed trauma from his childhood. Maria guided the family in deep meditations, teaching techniques to strengthen psychic defenses. Father Antonio performed blessings and prayers, but also opened himself to learning from other approaches. The battle culminated on a full moon night. The entity, feeling threatened, manifested with all its strength. The house shook, objects flew through the air, and a dark mist enveloped Pedro. But this time, the family was prepared. In a circle around Pedro, each member played their role. Lucia used psychological anchoring techniques to keep Pedro conscious. Maria led a protective chant, creating a field of positive energy. Father Antonio, in a fusion of tradition and innovation, performed a ritual that combined elements of Catholic exorcism with concepts of energy healing. Roberto and Carolina, hand in hand, channeled all their love and determination, forming a final barrier between their son and the darkness that threatened him. The spiritual battle lasted hours, with moments of intense darkness followed by flashes of light. Finally, at dawn, a deep silence fell over the house. Pedro, exhausted but lucid, looked at his family with clear eyes for the first time in weeks. In the days that followed, the Monteiro family realized that this experience had not only freed Pedro, but also completed a healing cycle for all of them. The house, which for so long had been a battlefield between light and darkness, now radiated an energy of peace and balance. The Monteiro story spread, no longer as a tale of terror, but as a testimony to the power of unity, understanding, and a holistic approach in the face of the unknown. Lucia, inspired by the experience, decided to specialize in a new area she called transpersonal psychology and spiritual healing. The Monteiro family, once victims of forces beyond their comprehension, emerged as a beacon of hope and knowledge, ready to help others who found themselves on the borders between the physical and spiritual worlds. 10 years had passed since the last supernatural manifestation in the Monteiro house. The residence, once feared, had become a place of pilgrimage and healing, known as the refuge among those seeking help for spiritual and psychological afflictions. Lucia, now a respected psychologist specializing in trauma and paranormal phenomena, had established a clinic in her father's old office. Her unique approach, combining traditional psychology with esoteric knowledge, attracted people from all over the country. Pedro, overcoming his childhood fears, had become a talented visual artist. His works, inspired by his experiences, were a fascinating mix of light and shadow, portraying the journey of the human soul through spiritual trials. Roberto and Carolina, though retired, devoted their time to guiding other families facing similar situations. Their story of perseverance and unconditional love inspired hope in times of darkness. Father Antonio, having found a balance between his traditional faith and a broader spirituality, had become a renowned writer and speaker, promoting dialogue between science, religion, and the paranormal. Maria, who had become a permanent figure in the Monteiro's lives, established a meditation and esoteric study center at the back of the property, complementing Lucia's work. On a spring evening, exactly 20 years after the first incident, the Monteiro family gathered for a celebration. The garden, once gloomy, was now lit with hundreds of candles, symbolizing the light they had brought to the darkness. During the ceremony, each family member shared how their experiences had transformed them. Lucia spoke about how fear became understanding, Pedro about how art helped him process trauma, and the parents about how love can overcome even the darkest forces. As they spoke, a serene and luminous energy seemed to envelop the property. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers passing by felt inexplicably drawn to the garden, like moths to a flame. At the height of the evening, Lucia proposed a moment of silence. In that instant of quietude, each person present, family, friends, and strangers, experienced a profound sense of peace and connection. It was at this moment that Lucia announced her plans for the future, to officially transform the Monteiro house into a center for study and healing, integrating psychology, spirituality, and art. A place where people could face their deepest fears and find light in the darkness. As the night progressed, guests departed one by one, taking with them a spark of the light they had experienced. The Monteiro family, gathered on the porch, observed the starry sky. Pedro, with a serene smile, broke the silence. You know, sometimes I think all of this happened for a reason. Not to torment us, but to transform us into beacons. Lucia nodded, adding, we transformed our curse into a blessing. Our pain into purpose. Carolina and Roberto, hand in hand, looked with pride at their children and at the house that now symbolized not terror, but hope. That night, as the family fell asleep, a deep peace hung over the house. The shadows of the past had completely dissipated, leaving only a soft, welcoming light, a testimony that even in the darkest experiences, there is the seed of transformation and healing. The Monteiro saga, which had begun with a Ouija board and indescribable terror, concluded as a story of resilience, love, and the incredible capacity of the human spirit to find light even in the deepest darkness. Their legacy would continue to inspire and heal for generations to come, an eternal reminder that true power resides not in supernatural forces, but in the human heart united in purpose and compassion.